Okay, I am here with Tom Morgan, who is a writer. He works for an investment company and he writes a newsletter called What's Important. Tom and I originally knew each other because I was at university with Tom's sister, Anna. Tom and I think we first we got back in touch maybe a couple of years ago, right? And Tom is just a fascinating voice in that he straddles two worlds, the world of finance and investment and the world of spirituality and philosophy. And you know, you talk about that, and you have a big audience of which I think maybe quite a lot of it is in the world of finance, investment, you know, investment banking. So that illuminates a fascinating interest in topics like spirituality and ancient philosophy in that world, the world of, which to some extent is the world of Wall Street. So it's not what you'd expect if anyone's read things like, you know, The Big Short or Liar's Poker, or those kinds of, you know, where with that kind of just Gordon Gekko style image of Wall Street. So we're going to talk about whatever we want to talk a bit about things like ecstatic experiences, mental health, psychedelics, but whatever we want to talk about, really. Let me start by asking you then, have you always been interested in things like spirituality?
Decidedly not. Why don't I give you a quick rundown of the story, because I think it will be good context. I kind of stumbled into the city of London after I graduated from Oxford with an unexpectedly good degree, thought I was hot shit, thought I'd just breeze through the world, was fired from my first job after 10 months. And then due to a series of very strange events, ended up working in the city, something that I regarded as kind of hilarious, given how much money people were paid for doing not very much, and the sense of entitlement that came with it. But on the plus side, it was incredibly intellectually stimulating, and actually the people were kind of cool, mostly. Some psychopaths, but mostly people who in finance are actually really cool and really nice and well-intentioned. But basically, I had a really good decade of 10 years of really enjoying it. And then after the 10 years that elapsed, my interests kind of started diverging. I started getting interested in big kind of societal shifts, what was going to happen in the future, the structure of reality, all this kind of stuff that had absolutely no benefit to my employers. And my employers saw that and were basically like, get lost. And at the time it hit.
So to put meat on the bones, this is you were working at, is it Credit Suisse?
Merrill Lynch and then Bank of America when Merrill Lynch went bellies up.
Okay, and so this was in the noughties?
I started in 2005, yeah.
And you were what, bond trader, equities, FX?
Equity sales, so a classic stockbroker.
In London?
In London, and then in 2009, I moved to New York because I was a US specialist my whole career, and I kind of wanted to play in the big leagues and moved over.
And you were kind of what were you like then? I mean, I think I met you like maybe once or so, but were you quite different now, would you say, or was there similarities?
I think I was a bit of a hollow man, interested in sleeping with a lot of women, going out and getting drunk, watching sports. You know, I was kind of well-traveled and hopefully like a little bit self-aware, but I was just doing what people in their 20s and 30s with too much money do. And I don't look back on it with too much judgment, but I think I certainly could have been a better person.
Okay. And so you said that you started to get interested in, like, you said the structure of reality. So that's obviously like you started to ask bigger questions about the nature of reality, the nature of the self. And this would have been when you were about, you know, what, kind of mid-30s?
Mid-30s. I think I have a major flaw as a person that, which really I think I got from Oxford, was basically like putting my own intellect on a pedestal. And initially I got very interested in very nihilistic but very clever sounding ideas like Sam Harris, Yuval Noah Harari, exponential tech, the singularity, all of these ideas that make you sound very, very bright, but when you really dig into them, have no spiritual core whatsoever. And I kind of carved out a brand for myself of like really like amplifying these ideas. And I think I got quite a big following in Silicon Valley because those ideas are catnip to that community, but they were all like catastrophically wrong. And then I got a job in a financial institution that was much more friendly than the previous one, and very, very, very quiet. And I was spectacularly underemployed and overpaid. And
it was very, very quiet.
Yes, it was the opposite of what you would think from a Wall Street bank. It was probably 3 times overstaffed. Everyone was delightful, but there wasn't really anything to do. And I was being paid a small fortune, by my opinion, to effectively do nothing. And I was too smug to do grunt work because I didn't want to dilute my intellect. And so I effectively spent long hours in a room doing nothing, surrounded by other men in a room doing nothing, and atrophying. And my health deteriorated, started putting on weight, and my mind started deteriorating. I started getting panic attacks. So I went through the US healthcare system. They couldn't find anything wrong with me, any single cause. Eventually, I went to a functional medicine doctor. That's semi-interesting, semi-quackery. I spent a year getting a functional medicine certification afterwards, but basically cut everything out of my diet, including like booze and rich food, which is hard to do in New York. And I started getting more and more clarity and more energy. And I wrote a book, but it wasn't really a book. It was sort of a cut and paste of 60 pages of quotes. And on the final day of the book, I had this moment where I was like, oh, I suddenly know what the Tao is. And I suddenly know what the hero's journey is. And at that moment, I snapped out of consensus reality. I had a satori. I had a psychotic break, depending on your DSM or biases. Best day of my life. Kind of walked around with my senses blown open, completely bathed in love. Was able to contextualize it neurologically later due to the work of Ian McGilchrist, which is a big tangent. But basically, I think I flipped from being kind of left hemisphere to right hemisphere for a day, which ended my world. It put me in like spectacular spiritual narcissism for about 3 months, full messiah complex, but also like conspirituality for a few weeks, as you would know, and like, you know, the demons, and I had the full range of experiences.
Wow.
And once that had settled out, I decided to quit my job, and basically become a hospice worker. I tried to be a social worker. I tried to be a recruiter to help other people manage these transitions. I tried to be a life coach, and they were all catastrophic. I tried to be a Jungian analyst, like
a Jungian analyst.
Yeah, which takes like.
Well, so you kind of began training.
Yeah, I began the process of thinking, do I need to be a Jungian analyst?
So again, let me just put some meat on the bones. So first of all, for 3 months, you're in this, you know, heightened, exalted, expanded state whilst working in a finance company.
Yes.
So, and also, are you married at this point?
Yes, I'm married, although I would say very precariously.
Precariously, you know, right, because you're in an altered state.
Yeah, and I've got kind of a full messiah complex. My wife is decidedly non-traditionally spiritual, and suddenly I'm spouting bullshit and buying Buddha statues and meditating and just being like as painfully obnoxious as you could possibly imagine, but in a full 180 from my previous personality. So my wife is like, who the hell did I marry? And the first book some moron told her to read on the night of my awakening was Adyashanti's End of Your World, which is like the most hardcore assessment of what an awakening is going to do to your existence, which is basically, yeah, you're going to end up stacking shelves in Boulder, because your life is over. So she was like, oh, I've lost my husband. All this stable life is gone. And then she's alienated from me by my own language and by her own interests. So it was very, very touch and go from a marital perspective.
And what about from a career and friends perspective? What was that like?
I was really wild-eyed and weird to friends. Some got it, some didn't. Most didn't, obviously. I think most people were just very concerned, particularly my family. Career, no one noticed because it was just such a weird professional environment. No one noticed.
And you're like walking barefoot around the office and
Yeah,
doing mudras and stuff.
Well, no, I just put on a suit and went to work. It was very strange, and like just sat at my desk building a website for a personal coaching business I thought I was going to put together, rather than like calling people on which stocks to buy. And then basically I had a coach at the time who I think was quite interested in big life changes. So he was like, quit your job. And I was like, fine, I quit my job, and then got into all these other fields. I think like my major mistake was basically letting my ego try and reinvent me. And that I didn't know what my meaningful direction in life was. And so I kept trying to grasp for things that were dictionary definition meaningful. And every time, the universe would close that avenue down very aggressively. And eventually,
how long was that phase of trying these different things?
3 years.
3 years. Wow. Yeah.
3 years.
3 years. That must have been difficult as well, because from a material point of view also, right?
Yeah.
And from a relationship point of view.
Well, I mean, this isn't hyperbole. It was as close to the definition of hell as I could comprehend, because I was like psychotically depressed. I was very, very mentally ill. Didn't see any way out of my predicament in terms of getting a job. Had gone from a managing director at an investment bank to being turned down for 20 grand a year graduate jobs. And all the light had gone from my eyes.
Graduate jobs in
anything. I was getting kicked in the nuts 100 times a day on LinkedIn. And I had no idea. I was so, left hemispheric, or however you want to put it. I was so abstracted from the world. I had no sense of guidance, and basically just got very lost for a very long time.
And when did that change, that from the kind of Satori awakening, that heightened, exalted sense of being in touch with the Tao, to the depression? When was that shift?
On the first day of the Satori, I alternated often minute to minute between two personalities, one of which was monotone and morose and convinced that I was spreading death with my words, and the other one was highly like floaty, bliss-like. And I believed I was just alternating between the hemispheres of my brain. I was basically going Jill Bolt Taylor to autistic and back. And then that oscillation slowed down. I think, you're okay? You're frozen. You're just frozen.
Sorry. Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
You can hear me. Yeah, no, I can hear you. Oh, you're back. And then basically I settled in, I think, the spiritual side for a while. But there was kind of this morose realism that I was very, very intimately connected to the world, and I felt everything very keenly. And I think I became very classically depressed and kind of weepy at that stage. But what actually happened, one of the strangest experiences of my life, I got very into kind of OG Jordan Peterson before he made his hard pivot. I was reading The Untethered Soul one day, Boxing Day of 2017, I think. So a few months after my awakening. And I went on a run around Central Park listening to Peterson talk about Adam and Eve. And his description, he gives a very florid description of hell in sort of the Hieronymus Bosch terms. And I came home, and at the end of the podcast, Peterson's asked a question by a listener in the lecture, basically saying, Peterson describes a vision where he gets thrown into a Roman amphitheater and has to fight the devil, sorry. And at the end of it, he goes to God and said, "Why did you do that?" And God says, "Because I knew you could win." And that was sort of ringing in my ears. And I had a very, very cold shower, freezing cold, after having been outside in freezing New York weather. And then I heard a voice qualitatively different from any voice I've ever heard in my life, from my body, say, "You're ready for the hero's journey. You're ready for a son." It was very strange. I've never had anything happen like that before. And me and my wife had been trying to get pregnant, but I hadn't really thought about having a kid in that context, or in the context of the hero's journey. I went outside, sat down on the couch, and one of the things that my awakening had felt like was a strong pressure between my eye, on the top of my forehead, right, the third eye area. And I just Googled, "is the third eye?" and Google auto-completed it to evil. And I then went to an article written by a woman who said that she had dabbled in the occult and was damned. And at that point, I was gripped with the conviction that because I dabbled in the occult when I was 13, like buying a book on magic and buying some crystals, like as far as I can remember, totally benign stuff, I was damned. And I entered that night, I had a vision of a snake eating my heart, sinking venom into my heart. And I had an absolutely cast iron delusion that I was damned. And I had a voice that started in my head and went on for about 2 to 3 years, just basically screaming to kill myself. And I ended up getting a rosary bead so I could try and pray the rosary. I'm not religious at all, but so I could try and pray the rosary to try and make the voice stop.
Wow.
Which it never did.
How long did you say you had that? You were in that experience?
About 2 years.
Oh my gosh! Wow.
The monologue remained hostile for about 2 years.
Wow.
And I tried everything in the interim to get out, like everything you could possibly imagine, pretty much. But there were clues, I think. So I'd always been very interested in psychedelics, but never really tried it, apart from kind of for shits and giggles at uni. And then the only time I laughed in 2 years, like actually laughed rather than an actor pretending to laugh, which is how it is when you're depressed, is there's an absolutely brilliant Twitter thread about a guy that accidentally takes ketamine and goes to work and meets the Prime Minister of Ireland. And it's just the funniest thing you've ever read. And basically, like, my wife was like, it was the first time she'd ever seen me laugh, like really in 2 years. And there was, I always, maybe that's a coincidence, but I kind of believe in coincidences less and less. And anyway, I went apex crazy the night of my son's birth, and became very, very interested in the concept of Moloch, which is again a bit of a diversion, but I think very pregnant to what was happening. And then I think the bit that kind of lands the plane a little bit for what we're talking about is that by February of 2020, I was non-functional. I was like, I'm done. I wasn't in suicidal ideation. I was just like so bone deep exhausted, you can't even imagine. Like, I'd just been fighting a fight for 3 years effectively, and didn't have
3 years since that kind of awakening experience, which
it was basically October 2017 to February of 2020, so less than 3 years, a fair bit less than 3 years.
And that was the depression period.
Yes.
Okay, and because the awakening was also in 2017, more or less.
Yeah, it was the end of October 2017. So sorry, it's not 3 years. It's about 2.5, 2.
Wow.
And getting kind of progressively worse. And so
before you tell me about that, tell me about during that time, what kind of support did you have? Are you just battling on your own during those 2.5 years? Did you speak to people? Did you speak to a therapist or a psychiatrist or a spiritual advisor, or are you just kind of trying to figure this out on your own?
Yes, is the answer. Yes to every one of those. I dated everything. I had a Jungian analyst for a while, which I would determine as 30% effective. Because he was in touch with the unconscious, which I can explain in a minute in terms of why it was relevant. I had a psychiatrist that I would determine as 5 to 10% effective. I had a therapist that was 20% effective. And then I was drowning, literally. So I tried to grab every piece of driftwood that I could. I got a certificate in existential humanistic therapy. I got into yoga nidra for a while. I read everything I could find on any spiritual path to try and get out effectively.
So right. And were these people giving you different descriptions of what you were going through?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, like, it's deeply damaging. I was effectively told by the psychiatry side that I was never getting out, and that my wife had to accept that I was just some dead-eyed freak for the rest of my life and had to be highly medicated, and was diagnosed with a DSM, and was stuck there. And then they would basically be like, everything was about titrating the quantity of the drugs. And one of the drugs, maybe
titrating mean?
oh, sorry, maybe I'm not getting the right term right, but just like incrementally adjusting the dosage.
Okay, and that was the conversation.
The conversation was basically they were looking through you to work out what you had and what they could give you. And they gave me an antipsychotic that meant I didn't dream for 9 months, because I think it just blocks your dreams. And so like that just kind of holds you in this. They were great at stabilizing me, I think. Like I was batshit insane initially. And I think knowing that you're in the embrace of a system is very helpful. But I remember like my wife is like medium famous, so she had resources. And she got me into the office of the head of psychiatry at Columbia very soon after my Satori. And I remember him just looking at me with these very cold blue eyes, very friendly, right? Kindly man, very nice man. And I was just like, I think there's more to this spiritually. And he just looks at me and he just points at his scalp and just says, if I stimulate this part of your brain, you will believe in God. There's no there effectively. And so it was this, it was this incredibly stark, like you're in the US healthcare system, you are a category, and we need to treat that with whatever the drug of the day is. And then there was the Jungian analyst that was like some sort of hybrid. And then you'd meet the spiritual gurus who'd be like, yeah, you got to bear back the shit out of this, get off your drugs, they're only retarding the process. I met some guy who said he'd have me in and out of the dark night of the soul in 2 hours. Like, it just like, the number of charlatans, well-meaning charlatans I met was insane, but also because I had no discernment, because my heart was closed and I was in my head, I had no ability of determining which one of these disciplines was true.
I mean, gosh, and what a head fuck as well that and I suppose I've been through comparable things and others have, and you're just offered completely divergent interpretations, and that just increases the head fuck. Like, am I screwed for life? And this is just neuronal. Am I a shaman? And this and and this is my awakening. Am I the Messiah? Like it's just.
I had all of that,
and that's our culture's pathology, is that we have no settled, completely different interpretations of this kind of experience.
It's so insightful, because like having a spiritual emergency in Manhattan is like having a burst appendix in the 15th century, right? Like just like there's like literally physically nowhere you can go, because either you're going to get sectioned, which doesn't really work the same way here, or you're going to go, like, it became apparent really quickly that I was too seriously ill to just go to therapy, right? But then there's no middle ground, and there's no one that can triage you from that perspective.
Wow. And how did you find the case? So there's the Columbia, there's the psychiatrist there, the kind of when the spiritual side of it, how did you find that? I mean, how did you find spiritual people to talk to or to ask their advice?
I don't think I spoke to that many spiritual people. I read a lot of spirituality. There just weren't that many people available to me. Like I got to know a guy called Richard Miller, who's sort of the guru of Yoga Nidra. He's good and straightforward. And I think a lot of these meditation guys hammer nail, right? And I think that I met a woman called Willoughby Britton, who's super interesting. I don't know if you've run into her.
Yes. She researches adverse meditation experiences. Yeah.
Which I think is very resonant with your work, right? Which is that like, we see this as a productivity tool and a cure-all. And it's like, no, like if you've got demons, they're going to kick the door in, right? Like there's a tiger in the forest, and most people aren't even told there's a tiger in the forest before they walk into it. But like in true meditation bro fashion, they'll just go for a 10-day Vipassana retreat having never meditated, and no one can deal with any of the psychiatric adverse effects. And so I got to know her quite well, and she kind of helped bridge that spirituality to neurology for me a little bit. But she was only really there during the crisis because she's so overwhelmed. Everyone's takeoff and no one's landing. And so there's like, I think there's one of her, and there's a bajillion people doing meditation retreats. So that was helpful. But really, in terms of like spiritual gurus, most of them were dead. And I was getting most of them from books. It was Carl Jung, Joseph Campbell. And then after my recovery, Ian McGilchrist has been the most useful from kind of a synthesis perspective.
So you were, fighting and struggling and drowning to understand what was going on for the best part of 3 years. And by the way, it's, for someone with kind of, your left hemisphere brain or whatever, you know, it sounds like you said you were like not functioning, but you were fighting hard. You were reading a lot. You were going and meeting people. So you were really, you know, and I can relate to that as someone who had like, you know, serious post-trip mental illness through Oxford. Like that kind of highly functional intellectual part of the brain is, you know, fights hard to make sense of what's going on and to keep afloat as well.
I think there's a really interesting lateral, which is that like the thing I've come to believe is that for me at least, and I don't want to shit on therapy for everyone, is that like for me it proved that the stuff, that whatever it was that was there, and we can come on to how I accessed it in a minute, was so far below the waterline that getting my unbelievably tight intellect to examine that is like using a spotlight to find the night. And I had so much pride in my own intellect. I was absolutely certain it was going to be what got me out. And it just dug me deeper because it was like I was constantly applying the scalpel of analysis and dissection to myself. Why can't I be happy? What's going to get me out? How am I going to rationalize my way out of this? What career path should I be? For me, it was career path that was the prison.
Right. Yeah.
And now, like almost all the modalities that I was looking at, probably with the exception of Jungian analysis, were all focused on like the 60 bits of conscious awareness that we use at any one time and trying to use that as the tool, which for me, maybe it works if you've never done any introspection in your life or you've got like quite modest problems. But for me, like whatever was happening was catastrophic. And so it was just not effective. It was incredibly damaging.
And, you know, so you're going through a kind of full-on mystical psychosis experience, but there's also part of you that's very used to success and achievement and career achievement. And that part of you is like, right, okay, what's the new you? How are we going to scale this? How are we going to make this big, right? And I can really relate to that as well.
No, that wasn't what happened. What happened was it was self-destruction. Because I'd notionally failed in finance 3 times, I felt that it was never really part of me and that I needed to reject that part of myself, and I needed to completely subsume myself into meaning and become a hospice worker and sacrifice everything that I was and really set fire to the success. Family be damned. Because, you know, in the first half of my life, I think I got self-interest quite right. You know, but not like immorally, but I was like, I'm going to be wealthy and successful. In the second half of my life, I was like, oh my God, I was so wrong. I need to reject all of that and become a saint, right? And neither of them were right, obviously. And I didn't, it ended up like the path I took afterwards was using sort of the left hemispheric and analytical skills in service of messages I find meaningful, which is why I do the job I do right now. But during the transition, I was like, I shouldn't be enjoying myself. It was like I was really, really punishing myself.
So now let's go back to that. Your son's just been born, and you said you had you described it as like an apex moment of breakdown.
Yeah, I mean it's incomprehensibly dark. So I'd panicked after a few months of like the spiritual awakening. I resigned out of my job in finance. I had three months of kind of sitting on the couch waiting for the universe to sort me out and training as a coach. And then I panicked, got really depressed, and was like, I need to go back into the world of work. So I went and worked for a data company selling data to hedge funds. And it was like everything I really enjoyed from my previous job had been stripped away. And I was selling a spreadsheet. To nerds, and it was 12 hours a day of work with probably 40 minutes of work, and so I went like fully insane, and at one point was journaling 6-7 hours a day in kind of nonsense stream of consciousness. And around that time, like I developed acne all over my face, so I couldn't stare at people. My chest was constantly on fire. Anna came over to visit, and I couldn't comprehend of a positive future. It was really the darkest time. And my wife was due in about a few weeks. And then I read an article, which I'm sure you're familiar with, Scott Alexander's Meditations on Moloch. No? It's the scariest thing I've ever read by an order of magnitude. It's about sort of the devil and the god of zero-sum games, and where you sacrifice everything of value for power. And at the time, it felt like I'd was sacrificing my child. And I had to sacrifice my child. I either had to die myself or I had to sacrifice my child to the devil, effectively. And I actually think, for reasons I can explain, that the as garbled and delusional as that logic was, it represented something archetypal that was true, that effectively I had to open up for my son, otherwise I was going to doom him with whatever I was. But at that time, I was sacrificing literally my time and attention, everything I had, for the sake of a very high-paying job that was driving me insane. So it was a coincidence that I read this at that time, and the way that I came across it was very coincidental, but it precisely articulated the kind of the Minotaur and, you know, the dead life that I'd acquired at that time, and it felt at the time I could only think in abstract terms. I could only think in a very, very weird, disconnected way. And then literally on the night my son Jack was going to be born, I had a push alert flash across my phone from the Medium blogging platform saying, I think it's saying, the battle for your soul has begun. And the push alert's real. Like, I went and Googled it, and it's like,
what is a push alert?
You know, when your phone screen, something comes up on your phone screen.
Push alert. I thought it was some kind of Tibetan phrase. Okay,
push alert. No. So literally, as we're going to the hospital, I pick up my phone, and there's an alert that just says the battle for your soul has begun.
From whom? From what?
It was someone had written a blog on Medium, and it was just a random title.
Okay.
Medium was pushing alerts to my phone.
But in heightened states, these kinds of things, you know,
the synchronicity, real or imagined, like fucked me up. And then I spent I had no connection to Jack, no joy, and no relationship with him or anyone. Couldn't really I couldn't perspective take. And I'm still very bad at it because I'm so intellectually abstracted. But basically I was like, I had no relationship at all with my child. But yet had a sense that he was going to save me. And I didn't quite know how. And then things all came to a head. I gave up on life, effectively. Because of my diagnosis, they'd said that I couldn't have psychedelics or ketamine. And so they were going to set me up for ECT, which I was like, brilliant, give me a hard drive white. I don't care if it has amnesia. I've got nothing in my life worth remembering or living for. I don't really care. So they were setting me up for ECT. But my psychiatrist, who, God bless him, was not effective, maybe he would be for other people, went on paternity leave and referred me in at my request to Colombia's primary expert on treatment-resistant depression and ketamine. And they had just started ketamine trials. And I think he just looked at me and was like, we literally have nothing left to lose. You know, you're a shell. Like, you're not necessarily going to kill yourself. But I was like, I can't live anymore. I don't have any energy to exist. And so they put me on a course of antipsychotics to prevent me from going manic during the ketamine, which gave me akathisia, which is the worst feeling in the world. It's when you have restless leg for your whole body. It's like your bones are on fire. So like the few days before my first ketamine infusions, I was existing in hell. Like, I remember holding the carpet fronds in our living room to stop my body from shaking itself apart, and was completely insane and done. I was effectively the bottom of the abyss. I went in for six ketamine infusions, I think maybe a week apart, maybe 2 a week. I can't really remember. It's all pretty blurry. And they were great. They were like taking all of the drugs, kind of big geometric shapes, sense of kind of time dilation, nothing really like coherent in it. And I would come out, I'd have like 24 to 48 hours of just being out from under my own consciousness, and then I'd be back in. So it didn't really help. And then I kind of went back to the doc. He's like, is it helping? I was like, yeah, temporarily, but not really. And he's like, well, we'll give you 2 more and then ECT. So I had the 7th, nothing happened. And again, I was going into a room, you'd have an infusion and you'd just kind of go home. There was no integration. I don't think they knew what they were doing in the nicest possible way. I mean, they saved my life, but like, they didn't really know what they were doing. They just knew that it worked. And then the 8th one, I don't know whether I'm applying the narrative afterwards, but effectively, I think I walked in knowing it's do or die. Like, quite literally, right? Like, it's ECT after this. Something in me was like, this is it. And I always think of like the Jung line, which is all mental illness, all neurosis is a function of the avoidance of true suffering. And I basically had a very different experience. I went into the trip state. I saw a black mass, like a mass of black, like a kind of amorphous black shape, not in the occult sense. And I went into it and dialogued with it. And I'm like, why are you here? And the night of Jack's birth, I dreamt that I dragged him into hell, in a very literal sense. And I had to give myself up for him. Otherwise, he was going to be dragged into hell. And that was the vision that I had under the ketamine, that I dragged my son into hell and he was going to suffer. It was as nightmarish as you can imagine. It did not feel redemptive. One of the turning points of my life was immediately afterwards. It was this lovely blonde nurse, this lovely Irish blonde nurse who kind of had held my hand metaphorically through it. And she saw me come out of this trip, obviously like so distressed. And she looked me dead in the eyes, into me, and said, "There's hope." And I folded. Oh, I'm struggling a little bit now, but I folded, completely folded. And I cried for 4 hours. And again, it didn't feel redemptive. And then I got better. I got a job exactly coincident with it. It was very strange. I got a job exactly coincident with it, so that the causality was never clear. Like, did I get the job because of the ketamine, or did I get the ketamine because of the job? Like, it was just this very kind of inner and outer merged. And my wife was like, within a week, you're a different person. And I could hear beauty again. I could hear music. When I was very depressed, there was a pane of glass between me and the world. And that pane of glass slowly dissolved, and I was kind of back in it again.
Wow. So there's the moment of crying, and you think that's like, I mean, it's interesting, right? I'm so glad to hear it as well. I mean, just say that. I mean,
thank you.
You know, when friends go into like underworld places, and they're broken and stuff, and then they come out of the underworld. I mean, it's just, and with all that you have to give the world, it's just so it's so great. It's so encouraging. Like, I guess people, you know, like, tell me a little more about you. Kind of, you said it in like a minute. I got better, and there was a difference. So, looking back, that was like 3 years ago. Is that right? Mm-hmm. What do you think happened? And tell me a bit more about how you got better. So there was this job. You got a job that was satisfying to you. You also, sounds like you could feel emotions again, which is interesting, because I guess as an outsider who hasn't taken ketamine ever, I thought of it as a dissociative, which kind of is an emotion number, which is why I'm sometimes a bit suspicious of it, because I think of maybe psychedelics help people by helping them to confront and experience deeply rather than dissociating. But from what you tell me, Tom, that sounds like it enabled a confronting experience as opposed to a dissociative experience. But
yes. Yeah. So this is where I go a little woo. My gateway drug for all of this was Joseph Campbell. And I think if there's a guiding quote of my life, it's folly or bliss and doors will open where only there were walls. And I have a unfounded belief that our hearts are electromagnetic sensors. That's science, right? That's why an EKG works, right? And that typically most people's heart centers are closed. And I think as a very intellectually abstracted person, I was. And then I think during the crisis, I went full-blown abstracted left hemisphere intellect, right? And I think, the left hemisphere is competitive with the right, the left hemisphere lies. I think I got dragged fully into that state of being separated from the world, so that I wouldn't confront whatever it was I needed to confront that was closing me off from the world. And I'm still not entirely sure what that is, but I have some views. And so what happened was I got dragged down into the abyss, and then I don't know what role the ketamine played, but it enabled me to confront that thing And then after that point, I gained a sense of openness, and that openness manifests in a literal heart sense when I'm on my beam, or when I'm energetically doing something I should be. And so what happened was, I let go after I got better, got a job back in finance that was, you know, spectacularly meaningless. So I kind of let go of the crushing search for meaning. But while I was doing it, I kept writing. And instead of writing the abysmal, directionless spiritual writing I'd been writing to try and save myself during my crisis, because I had no discernment, I started writing about a synthesis of finance and spirituality. And I wrote one piece and I sent it to my old distribution list, and they called me up and they were like, just come and do this for us full time. Do whatever you want.
What's a distribution list?
I had like 100 people on my email list that were old clients. And I sent it to my current boss as well as 99 other people. And he called me out of the blue and was like, we'll invent a job for you that
Wow.
could not have been more of a description of my dream job. And we'll let you do whatever you want and kind of give you patronage for a year. Well, sorry, not for a year, forever, while you just follow your bliss and do whatever you want.
What?
And so, yeah.
Incredible. Tell me what was in that piece then?
It was about the use of attention within an investing context. As I believe that, you know, like our right hemispheric attention as determined by our bliss essentially guides us to our evolution. You know, following your bliss guides you to your evolution, and that is mediated by the heart center. I didn't mention any of that shit, but I basically was talking about how like usage of attention is one of the most powerful concepts within investing. And it wasn't very good, but it was differentiated. And it was the first time I didn't reject my finance skills, but integrated them. And then, you know, if I was a mystical person, I'd be like, well, that's the audience that I'm supposed to be reaching, which is a highly rationalist audience that won't swallow anything that hasn't been Trojan horsed in with how it's going to make you wealthier. Because I know that everyone cares about these things, but most spiritual writing is dog shit, or is already written for people that are already spiritual. There's no transitional literature. And as I've kind of got a lot more into this, a lot of the people that you and I kind of know mutually, there's a community of people that are kind of guiding people from the left hemisphere to the right, guiding people from science to spirituality. And that clearly is where I've been placed. And the more I do of that, the better my life goes. But I've had to let go of attachment to certainty, direction, schedules, income, ambition. You know, I've had to let go of all those things, which I was fine to let go of because all of them were crushing me while I was in crisis. I'm not bothered at all.
So in the Joseph Campbell hero's journey sense, this was the return from an underworld experience and the coming back to the world you left, and being able to combine those worlds and to walk between those worlds and to bring gifts from the underworld back to the village you left or whatever.
Yeah, it sounds so grandiose. I mean, I'm writing a book at the moment.
No, it's not. I mean, the hero's journey is a somewhat grandiose thing, but it's also, sometimes it fits.
Yeah, I believe I had a classic hero's journey. And I think when you say it to people that don't understand the context, they think that you're saying it's heroic. But most of my time was spent crying in the fetal position in the shower. You know, like it could not have been more pitiful and less heroic, but it ended in the way that it should do in the classical definition of heroism, which is you become integrated into the world, right? You become differentiated and integrated. And as a result, you get this sense for truth where you can talk to other people and help them through that situation as well, which is kind of where I've ended up doing my side gig.
Right. Exactly. And it's also what I find so interesting talking to you and encouraging as well is that, you know, that there is a place for people who sometimes experience unusual states of mind, or, you know, spiritual states of mind, and have that kind of insight, and in all kinds of different spheres as well. Like, it's not just like, okay, you know, you need to go into spiritual land now and, you know, work in Glastonbury or something. Like, there are people who have that side to their experience and who've learned to kind of come to terms with it rather than be overpowered by it in all kinds of different fields. there's, you know, like in big hospitals, in businesses, in academia, and so on, you know. And it's just, it's interesting, and maybe some of them don't talk about it, but they still kind of can bring that perspective and those gifts to their work in these different spheres.
Yeah, it's the kind of thing I'm obsessed with at the moment, which is John Bevacki basically being like, we don't have a wisdom tradition. We don't have people that can marry both sides. And, you know, I think that I made a lot of mistakes. I made like an infinite number of mistakes, but one of them was like, you know, Jill Bolt Taylor, when she had her stroke and lost her left hemisphere, she couldn't tell where she and the world ended, and she couldn't dial an ambulance. She lost all egoic agency. And I think that our culture, I have a weird view that basically the right hemisphere has access to the Tao. It has access to truth. So people that are quote unquote enlightened, when they talk, they have this kind of spiritual transmission, sorry. But also like a lot of spiritual people aren't very effective, and a lot of effective people aren't very spiritual. And like, I think I got kind of addicted to the bliss early on. I was like, I'm just going to meditate myself to enlightenment. And I always wonder whether like enlightenment isn't a pathology. Right, that like these people don't have friends and they don't have families and they have no connection to anything. And I'm like, that seems not desirable, even though it probably feels really good, because I know how good it feels, even for like a fleeting moment. And I just think that like what's needed now, and this is a value judgment, right, but what's needed now is people that hybrid, people that are highly effective, you know, the Taoist sage, right, that they're like, they use a minimum amount of effort with a very strong ego to get the maximum amount of result. That's what you need. That's what a wise person is, right? And I feel that like we've kind of lost that in terms of people that have spiritual experiences often go like way off the other direction because there's so little response to that in society. But also there's no instruction being given to people as to how to be effective. Okay, so now you've had a Satori, right? Like it's going to take you 3 years for this to bed in. You know, a good piece of advice I was given and ignored was like, it's going to take 4 years, right? Like Richard Miller was like, it's going to take 4 years. Don't talk to anyone. Don't write about it for 4 years. And like, I'm writing my book 5 years later, right? And I'm still not sure I've got any of it right. But like, I talked to everyone about it and wrote about it immediately. And it was fucking awful. It's a terrible idea, right? But we have no resources or guidance for people. And I've noticed that the acceleration of this process is happening as I think we're hitting this kind of phase shift, which I know is very common for people that have had ecstatic experiences to think that everyone's about to have one. And you've written very eloquently about that. But I do believe we're going through either a slow motion or a quite rapid transition now. But we haven't given people tools or guidance for it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll talk about that, about what you think needs to be there that isn't there. But I'll first tell us a bit about what then, you know, so this was, this ketamine treatment was 2.5 years ago or so, or 3 years, right? About 3 years ago.
Yeah.
What then happened? What was your recovery path? Did you need further? Because there'll be some people watching this, maybe still somewhat in that place.
Yeah.
And so did you need further infusions? Did you need therapy? What did you find helpful, or what did you need after that?
Nothing. I got a job that made me do 300 pitches in about 11 months. So I got my confidence back. I kind of reassembled my ability to speak because I couldn't really speak or didn't have any confidence. And then I started writing increasingly about stuff that I really cared about. I had a very fortuitous appearance on quite a famous podcast that went very, very well. And then, but all of the stuff that I was talking about
was that podcast, if people are Googling it?
Infinite Loops. I've been on it 3 times, but the first one went well relative to other guests. And it's quite a widely followed podcast. And basically everything I was saying on the podcast was shit I really believed in, exactly pertaining to all of this stuff. And I was like, okay, people care. And so I lent into it. And the more I lent in, the more of an audience I got, and the better I felt, and the better my life went. I've had 2, maybe 3 psychiatry sessions since, once a year, basically for the psychiatrist to be like, you good? And I'm like, yep, good. I'm still on meds, which I think is very important to mention. I don't want it to sound like some sort of heroic recovery. The meds have 0 side effects as far as I can tell. And I don't want to go off them because why not? Like everything in my life is perfect. I don't feel the need to bear back it, but it's an ongoing question mark. Will I be on these for the rest of my life? How much are they blunting it? Like, am I only normal because I'm on meds? Like, it's an open question, but I feel it's very dishonest in a situation to tell people you're not on meds.
And you found the kind of the titration that works for you.
Well, what was strange is that I felt like I was having very, very bad side effects. Like, I was on lithium for a while, and that's what gave me like all over face acne, and like, or they slowed me down, or they made me faint. And what was funny is I can't work out in retrospect what was imagined, what was a symptom of the depression. I wasn't really eating. Like, so the side effect profile, I don't think I have any now, but I can't tell because I've been on them for so long. I don't know what the side effects are. So I don't want to find out. Which maybe
they don't blunt your kind of dream life, your kind of spiritual life.
No, I feel like I have a great relationship with my unconscious, and I have to be much more aware of signals from my environment than I was before, and I had to kind of operate in a slightly different modality. I'll give you an example that's fucking batshit crazy, to be honest, but it's relevant, highly relevant. It was that about 2 years afterwards, I was like, I still don't know what the vision about pulling Jack into hell was about. And whilst I still don't have clarity, I believe that you can say, can you give me an answer? And stick with the question. And that week I was writing something for work using Jurassic Park as a metaphor. And a lovely woman whose podcast I was on posted a video of mythological analysis about Jurassic Park. And it's one of the coolest things I've ever seen. Because I think it's brilliant. It's a brilliant piece of analysis by a guy called Mike Hill. He effectively talks about how Spielberg made Jurassic Park a metaphor for parenthood. That you have Dr. Grant is this very predatory, closed off, left hemispheric, obsessed with dead things guy that's terrified of children. And then what happens is the T-Rex emerges from the fencing and forces him through crisis into the children's car, where at that point in the movie, all the imagery transitions from him being predatory to him being nurturing. And it's much more complex and nuanced than that. But basically, like, I watched this and I was like, holy shit, right? Like, that's the hero's journey arc is from being closed to being open. And then my best friend bought me an I Ching. And I'm not typically a believer in these things, but my life has changed in terms of my receptivity. So I was like, I took the bones and I rolled them and I said, why did I have a crisis? And I've only asked it questions a few times, and it responded with the thunderclap, which is the fear that shows a man his virtues. And that, like, there was always this extraordinary fear of the devil associated with my son, and that I had to die in order that he should live. And I felt that it was like the redundant part of myself that needed to be transcended and sacrificed in order that I could become an open person. And subsequent to my recovery, I have become a much more open person in terms of what I disclose to people, like we're doing right now, in terms of how I react emotionally to movies and stuff, but also my ability to navigate the world is much more nuanced energetically, which I think has served me incredibly well. And I think I'm not a perfect father, but I'm better than I would have been.
And it's just fascinating in these kinds of, experiences, how mythological they are. Here we are, these 21st century urban secular people, and in these moments of crisis, suddenly it's about God and the devil, heaven and hell. Isn't it interesting? Like, we're like 21st century humans, and our brains are still like, and our subconsciouses are still like medieval and mythological and archetypal. And I feel like whenever I talk to people about these kinds of experiences, it's always like it's like fair dues, Carl Jung. You were onto something with that kind of stuff.
Well, the biggest change in my psyche has basically been the idea that there's a there, and myth is talking about the there, right? That, like, Joseph Campbell said that the purpose of myth was to harmonize the mind and body. That basically the mind rambles off in strange ways and wants things the body doesn't want. And I think for body, you could say right hemisphere, right? That basically, like, your abstracted side of yourself has all these plans for your life, But what you'll start doing is grinding up against where you should actually be going based on your evolutionary flow, right? So for me, it's being stuck in a finance room full of dying people. That grinding starts and that dissonance starts. And the myth basically speaks to, you shouldn't do that. You know, like, I'm kind of obsessed with like the concept of Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul, who are these people who make like consecutive terrible decisions, getting themselves further and further away from the person they're supposed to be, and their lives go disastrously badly. And I think we look at that in isolation in the world and be like, well, there's no real objective morality. They just make dumb decisions. And I think what I got from this is that there is a there, there's a Tao there, there's a universe there, there's a God there, whatever you want to call it. All the words are appalling. But if you learn how to detect that thing and align with it, your life goes better. But when your feeble consciousness cracks for a second and you encounter these archetypal forces, they break you. Your brain's not big enough to take these things in. They'll burn you up. And that was my experience initially. Like, I had a dream. I dreamt in symbols the first night of my awakening, and I dreamt of a glowing ring, which apparently is a big Jungian thing. But my psyche was like, the only time I've seen that before is in the movie The Ring, which is the scariest thing I've ever seen. And I'm going to die in 7 days because that's what it means in that movie. So I became delusional that I was going to die in 7 days, even though that was like a completely ludicrous leap to make. It was because the only concept I had for that ring was something that was in popular culture. So I needed a story to explain it, even though that story was wrong. But I also wonder is that ring so terrifying in that movie because it speaks to that archetypal experience, right? You don't know where everything originates.
Yeah, so you're having to kind of, again, it talks about these kind of cultural resources. People are having these symbols, and we're all of us having to learn how to relate to symbols. And when I say all of us, like people who have ecstatic or psychedelic experiences and go into altered states, symbols emerge, and we have, I actually did a literature degree at university, and that gives us, that's where the humanities have some use. Is that it's about how to relate to symbols at different levels, the literal, the metaphorical, all of that. But on the whole, of course, we're not taught kind of how to relate to symbols.
Well, we're actually told that they don't exist, which is much worse, right? That everything's relative and that everything's postmodern, right? And that means that you can get a really long way from the person that you're supposed to be. And the thing that I saw was that basically these guys in middle age had accumulated so much that the cost of sacrifice was so steep they would rather kill themselves because they were worth more dead than alive. And when they were supposed to be, moving into the second half of life, they didn't have the freedom to do it. Okay.
Well, this brings us to, the work you're doing. So you are the job you were offered and the job you're doing still is that you're writing a newsletter which is distributed what would you say it's every week, and what kind of people are reading it?
Every other week. My audience is self-selected on Twitter. And then our own internal clients for a wealth management firm. We run a fair bit of money. And I hold the as yet completely unsubstantiated view that our clients care about it because they're high enough up Maslow's hierarchy that they can start to answer these questions. So like it's been proven out on a micro scale by my audience on Twitter that there's a niche for me. But I don't know what's next. I have a theory. Something I only really realized a few weeks ago. I did originally think that all of this was about thinky intellectuals groping backwards using long words and abstract terms to rediscover God, right? Like, oh yeah, you've invented the Serenity Prayer, you moron. And I don't think that's it at all. I think what's happening right now is that this very small group of people, who I know you're familiar with all of them, is actually building a new map that integrates science and meaning and shows us where we matter in it. And my sole goal is to synthesize that map without being smart enough to create the pieces, so that highly rationalist left-brain people can get enough science, a good enough Trojan horse to understand how they can apply these kind of hero's journey concepts in a deeply practical way without it ruining their life. So that's my entire, I want to stop predominantly middle-aged people from getting stuck, because that was what I saw as the greatest unmet need. And I want to communicate this meaningful message using my kind of unique finance audience skills.
Right,
Even though that's
right.
relatively small, that's a
I
small
get it.
niche.
So you said that some people were kind of so, they built up such a kind of particular life for themselves that they just felt stuck and they felt they couldn't shift it. So tell me about that, because you're also in a particular overlap where you're talking about the psychological, the spiritual, but it's the material as well. There's the strong, there's the strong material incentives or kind of pressures on the self of, right, I need to support this lifestyle, I need to earn this amount of money, which means I need to do this job. I imagine that a lot of people in Wall Street are, maybe, I don't know, because you know it better than I do. I mean, I was a business journalist for 10 years writing about investment banking, but as a journalist on the outside. But what's your thinking about that? I mean, what's your relationship to that?
It's
Does that
complex.
make sense?
Yeah, totally. No, it makes total sense. The thing I always tell people is the nastiest, scariest quote I've ever heard from Jung, which is, there's no greater burden a child can bear than the unlived life of the parent. And it hits men of a certain age, like right in the nuts. Because I think what happens is that particularly American tri-state area finance people, they look at their current stuck situation where they've lost interest in what they're doing. The toothpaste is out of the tube and it's not going back in. And they're like, all I can see is a room with fewer bedrooms and me equally unhappy. And there's no one really talking to them and saying that actually you're going to have fewer bedrooms and maybe fewer cars, but your wife's going to be happier, maybe, if you married the right person, and your kids are definitely going to be happier because their dad's going to come alive again. And that's a very difficult proposition for people, because there's no Moses, right? There's no one saying that, yes, you're with the Egyptians right now. Yes, there's going to be an awful long period in the desert, but there is a promised land. There's almost no one talking about the promised land in American society in a way that's actually making it real. And I think one of the biggest problems, and I feel very passionate about this, is that the spiritual people, because they're so ineffective, to be rude, right? They don't ever explain to people what's in it for them. And they're like, oh, and for me, it was like, give everything up, relinquish everything and you will be happy. And what the Taoists, I think, got right is that, like, if you follow the Tao, you'll be materially successful. It won't be in a predictable way, right? Like, I'm randomly getting like vast amounts of money randomly sent to me through like accidents, like community chest in Monopoly style stuff, where I'll randomly stand on a square and suddenly like $10,000 will appear from like the equivalent of a dead aunt dying all the time. I'm in this really bizarre kind of abundance thing where I'm not materially successful in any means, but when I'm on the path, I get rewarded for it. And, like Viveki's work is like, the path of wisdom is associated with eudaimonic happiness, hedonic happiness, meaning, connectedness, thriving. What the literature doesn't do anywhere is say that if you can get good at navigating this path, your life is going to go great. It's just, we can't really describe how it's going to go great because it will be quite unique to you. That needs to happen, because otherwise you're just asking people to give stuff up for no real upside. And everyone just gets really angry with you, as they should.
Right. I mean, I suppose, there are spiritual people who are not successful financially. And they haven't, and in a way that's okay. It's not even that, but I also know that there'll be some, spiritual people watching this, and they're desperate to make a bit more money, to not be so hard up, right? And they're going to hear like, well, they're going to think, well, great for you, Tom, and they're going on manifesting courses, and they're trying all the, they're forking out for a Tom Robbins course. And maybe, it's hard out there. It's hard out there. And, we had the advantages of a very good education and that kind of thing. So I guess the point is, I feel is like, partly it is possible to be spiritual and live a good life. And the material side doesn't totally massively work out. But the other side is like, a lot of people who have spiritual gifts they don't ever get good business advice, you know, and like and they could really like benefit from that. And what they do is they get coaches who tell them how to manifest, and they don't get practical advice.
Right. So I've got views, and they're probably a bit harsh because they applied to me too. The first is you need to pick the DAO where your gifts meet what the world needs. You got to get them both right. If you want to be a drummer in your garage and no one likes your music, that's not what the world needs, right? You need to see tangible rewards for what you do. But I do believe there's a structural problem with our society that does not reward the right kind of people. And I'm working now at a very early stage on trying to arrange a patronage system, because all the people that I find most impressive in, for want of a better term, your circle, are not always earning what they need to earn. And I don't believe that's often a deficiency of theirs. So like, I hear that, but the full rejection of materialism often just strikes me often as bitterness. And the thing I will say, and I'm happy to go as weird on this as you want, I think manifestation is black magic and potentially incredibly evil and should never be practiced by anyone unless they've been fully.
There we go. That's a good controversial view.
Yeah. Well, unless you're really sure that that you're smarter than the universe, maybe you shouldn't be bringing things into it. I believe I've done it a couple of times in my life with catastrophic consequences. But I always think of Chairman Mao's Smash Sparrows campaign, where he's like, oh, the sparrows are eating all the grain, we're going to kill all the sparrows. They killed all the sparrows. There was a locust infestation that killed 50 million people, right? It's the worst man-made disaster in human history because he intervened at a single point without understanding the whole system.
Right.
Be careful what you wish for. The myths across time, the myths across time say, do not wish for things. Flow with it. Want things, fine, but do not manifest things. Like Aladdin down. Like think about all the people that go to the witch and say, I want to be beautiful, and something horrifying goes wrong somewhere else. Spiritual people randomly secreting themselves to things that they want. My biggest concern with manifestation is not that it's bullshit, it's that it works. So I just feel really passionate about that, and I'm really.
I love it. So you are writing and bringing a certain world to connect together with another world. You're organizing online investment events with Ian McGilchrist, and talking about his spiritual tomes and others, like maybe Alex Bina. Did you have him? I mean, with some interesting people. Did you have a sense of like, there's partly about people living fuller lives. What about the systematic aspect of Wall Street? What do you have thoughts on that? Is that things you write about what needs to change there if this has got kind of Moloch type zero sum dynamics? Is that something that you kind of think about or write about?
Yeah, I think I write about it incessantly. The problem is that you have to realize if you're going to be consistent with your own thesis, the individual level is probably the only level that's applicable, because all emergent movements are bottoms up, right? So if you're the guy that what needs to be fixed in finance is X, you're probably going to be wrong, and it's probably going to have unintended consequences. And what you're seeing in finance right now is the repeated failure of top-down interventions, and they just don't learn. Again and again and again and again, there'll be some kind of top-down intervention that's going to go wrong. But I think COVID really changed things systemically in the US, and it gave people slack. The antidote to Moloch is slack. Weirdly, coincidentally, the first article I read after I gained the mental stamina to read a long article was Studies on Slack, which is the follow-up article multiple years later to Meditations on Moloch, which is basically how do you kill zero-sum games? And it's by creating space in the system for emergence to come in. It's opening your heart enough for emergence to come in. It's a really
Slack. You mean the app Slack?
No, fuck no. That's the worst app in history because it literally sucks your
time. Then you mean what do you mean?
Slack is the worst possible term for this, but it's the one that he uses, which is basically if you're working 100 hours a week in a Wall Street investment banking job, you can't you can't reorient your life, right? Even though you're getting a grinding problem, like you're getting the call to adventure, but you're ignoring it because you're so busy. And then suddenly you start meditating, and that creates 2% gap. And then that kicks the doors in, right? And that slack of that meditation, or that you decide to go on vacation, or you get confined to your room for 6 months by COVID, that creates this womb, and something grows into the womb. Slack is not an empty space. It's what fills in, what comes in from something outside of you to reorient you.
To your busyness, to your cocoon.
Yes, exactly right.
So this sounds quite Taoist Zen, the creativity of emptiness.
Precisely. And it's really funny is reading Scott Alexander, who's like a hyper rationalist, and he's like, this sounds like somebody from the Tao Te Ching, and I'm like, yes it does, but it's a really hard concept to explain and understand. It's taken me like years, and I still don't think I'm there, but it's like this kind of negative space that something can grow into, and when you create space in your life for that, you can be receptive to new signals.
Yeah, that's really interesting. There's a lot. I mean, we've got about 5 minutes left, and there's a whole lot more we could talk about. I'm sure people want to know about, practical steps for creating Slack, this concept that we've just raised. And maybe it touches on that. But let me end by first of all saying, thank you so much for being really open, and we will talk after this about how we're going to present this and all of that, what you want to share of it. So looking forward, I think I want to go back to this point you made about we don't have cultural resources for people having ecstatic experiences, awakening experiences, mystical psychosis experiences. It's something I very much feel as well. We don't have ecstatic literacy, and yet lots of people are having awakening experiences, sought or unsought. Psychedelics are becoming more and more available, and there are risks to that, which is like people lose their minds, or they go down rabbit holes, or they go into conspiracy theories, or they get taken advantage of, or they just suffer. What do you think we needs to emerge or evolve? What do we need, or to be built?
Well, maybe it's a bit too convenient, but Slack, right? Like, so I think even the most tolerant spouse or employer, they're like, I see you're going through some stuff, maybe 3 weeks, maybe 3 months. And most career transitions take 3 years. For me, it was nearly 3, right? To get to someone good was more than 3 years. And our society is singularly not set up for that in any way. And even on a micro basis, there's, as I said, in Manhattan, there's nowhere you can go. I think you need safe spaces where you can have the guru, but you also have someone that's trained to deal with psychotic episodes and can medicate you if need be. Those two worlds are kept separate. And then I find that really weird, in that I had to go to the guy that said get off the drugs to get the spiritual guidance, and I had to go to the guy with the drugs to say that God's a feature of neurology. And it's interesting, and I think it speaks a lot to the silos that the American mental health system works in, that you don't get hybrids, or at least I only had the experience I had, but I don't feel that there's a good middle ground. And I feel that one thing that's a bit weird is that, and this may be a strange thing, but like you talk about shaman, right? Like I felt that I became a shaman, which sounds like really grandiose, but in all previous human cultures that had shamanism, the shaman themselves had gone through this destructive experience, this hero's journey, this death and rebirth. And I think that gave them the ability to walk between worlds, and it gave them this fundamental empathy with people going through similar problems. And I think the problem is that we think we can get that from 3 years of studying the DSM or however long it is, right? These crazy long apprenticeships. I would be more interested in hearing from people that have gone through these dark nights and come out the other side, and what helped them and what didn't. My value to the world is in the mistakes I made, because I made so many. And more Moses, right? More people that are in meaningful existences on the other side, more wise people that we can look to. Because almost every wise person that I found, and there aren't many, they've all had horrifying dark nights. I can't find anyone that I'm aware of that, when you really dig into their bio, haven't had like a prolonged experience with depression. And I don't know how necessary that is, but I think it helps.
That's a great place to end our conversation. Thank you very much, Tom. And it's not easy to talk about these things and to go to those places in conversation. So it's extremely helpful. I found it really interesting, and I can relate to so much of your story as well. Yeah, thanks. Any last kind of things you want to add that I didn't ask you? I mean, I feel we could definitely have a really long, fruitful second conversation. Sure. A lot of stuff we've touched on, but then any kind of,
I guess my last word would be a line I heard from Jonathan Pajot, who's this like Christian symbolist, and he says that love is mutually accelerating disclosure. Apparently, like you can do this thing where you set two people opposite each other, staring into each other's eyes, and get them to say increasingly revealing things about themselves, and it kind of creates this like synthetic love. But what I've realized is that maybe I overshare now, but the more open I am with the world about like my inner state and what went on with me, the more response I get in terms of people seeking me out and being like, I'm in this. When I felt so alone, right? I'm in this right now. And I feel like often all you can do for people is just hold their hand. You can't make it go away. You can just be like, yeah, it's going to end, but it's a symptom of it that you feel like it won't end. Like it's literally a symptom that you can't envisage a positive future. And so sometimes knowing that is helpful, sometimes it isn't. But often nothing's going to help. Like nothing at all is going to help. But knowing that there's someone there who's just going to hold your hand through it is meaningful. And that's kind of what I'm hoping to do with people. And so if my disclosure helps other people realize that, the one thing we don't really talk about, successful people don't talk about mental health. People certainly don't talk about mental health when they're in the middle of a bad mental health experience, because they have no credibility. And so
they certainly don't talk about mysticism, and they don't talk about mystical psychosis, or they don't talk about spiritual emergencies. People do open up about depression and anxiety now, but and I guess they're beginning to open up about this other stuff. But this is a bit of the kind of frontier, isn't it? What we're talking about.
Yeah, I hope so.
Okay, thank you, Tom. Thank you very much.
No, thanks for listening.